Thank you so much for joining us here at the historic Metropolitan AME Church here in Washington, D.C. My name is Devin Jerome Crawford. I'm the staff director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School, and we're so grateful for all of you for joining us for this morally urgent and historic conversation on the legacy of the reparations movement for Black Americans and Mrs. Callie G. House. We're so grateful for our partners here for the National Council of Churches with Bishop Vashti McKenzie, and for all of those who are here from the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and the National Congress of Black Women. We thank you for joining us here today. I want to introduce our panelists today for this conversation, and I'll introduce them. And as I introduce you, I ask that you come to the seats in the center of the sanctuary. We have Pastor William H. Lamar IV, the pastor of the Metropolitan AME Church here in Washington, D.C. He will serve as our moderator for this afternoon's conversation. Formerly, he was a managing director of leadership education at Duke University Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina. Pastor Lamar has served congregations in Hyattsville, Maryland, Monticello, Florida, Orlando, Florida, and Jacksonville, Florida. Through his association with Duke, Pastor Lamar convened and resourced executive pastors of large churches, denominational finance executives, young denominational leaders, Methodist bishops, and the constituency of Lilly Endowment's Sustaining Pastoral Excellence Program. Can we all thank God for Pastor Lamar and his leadership today? Next, we have none other than Bishop Vashti Murphy McKenzie. She is the first woman who was ordained and consecrated as a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She is an electrifying preacher and an anointed woman of God, serving at the highest level of the episcopacy in the African Methodist Episcopal Church since the year 2000. Bishop McKenzie is a national voice for women, servant leadership, and social justice. Her ministry, which has seen her supervise more than 600 churches around the world, is diverse, from sanctuaries and seminaries to corporate boardrooms and national and international seminars and conferences. She serves as the president and general secretary of the National Council of Churches. Bishop McKenzie. Next, we have the Reverend Professor Cornell William Brooks. Professor Brooks is the Hauser Professor of the Practice of Nonprofit Organizations and the Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership and Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also the director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice and at the School Center for Public Leadership, and visiting professor of the Practice of Prophetic Religion and Public Leadership at Harvard Divinity School. Professor Brooks is the former president and CEO of the NAACP, a civil rights attorney, and an ordained minister in the AME Church. Professor Brooks. And finally, she is on her way. I'll introduce Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Congresswoman Lee is an influential and forceful voice in Washington, D.C. She is serving her 14th term as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. She represents the 18th Congressional District of Texas, centered in Houston, which is the energy capital of the world. Considered by many as the voice of reason, she is dedicated to upholding the constitutional rights of all people, and she is the sponsor of H.R. 40, the bill in the House for a commission to study reparations in the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome our auspicious panel today.
A great joy to host you all, and before we go any farther, I think it's important for me to acknowledge that many hands have made this work light, and I want to acknowledge the executive minister here, the Reverend Cosette Thomas, our operations director, Ms. Lucille Knowles, our executive assistant, Ms. Ruth Fullwood, our ushers and volunteers, our technicians. Would you give them all a hand, those who have worked so hard to provide for your hospitality? Now, I want to begin by thanking the great historian Mary Frances Berry, who introduced me to Callie House. And I think it is a wonderful thing that there are those who excavate our past to show us our future. I think this is truly a Sankofa moment that we have to go back and catch up with our ancestors because they were light years ahead in many instances. And so I'm thankful to call the name of Callie House. Would you just call that name again, Callie House? We call her name and we welcome all of the ancestral spirits and energies who continue to push us toward justice. And again, we thank you and welcome you to Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, the longest continuously owned property by persons of African descent in the District of Columbia. And we praise God for the opportunity to be present. And so Callie House was born in 1861. Callie House was wife, mother, laundress, seamstress, and she led an organization of 300,000 members. Did you hear that? 300,000 members. She was around in a period when a white gentleman was traveling, and he put together a pamphlet called A Plea for the Ex-Slaves. His purpose was to argue, again, now this was a staunch Confederate arguing for pensions for ex-slaves. And listen to what his argument was in the pamphlet that he wrote and was selling, that if ex-slaves got pensions, then it would help to lift up the economy of the South, because shortly, whatever they got, they would turn it over into the hands of the white persons who controlled the economy. And so we still have to, in paying attention to her, watch for those who would lift us up not for their benefit, but not for our benefit, but for their own. And we'll talk about that. I also want to talk about the fact that Callie House, as so many in our tradition who have fought for what was good for the masses, that she ran into trouble from comfortable middle-class Negroes. Let me say that one more time. As is the case with most of those who work for the masses of our people, she ran into trouble from comfortable, educated, connected middle-class Negroes who told her that what she was doing was going to make white people mad. She got very little support from the black church. Ida B. Wells Barnett, when she was doing her work in Chicago as an AME preachers were afraid to stand with her. And it was Booker T. Washington who did so many wonderful things, but all of us who have read history, especially that wonderful book about Booker T. as the Wizard of Tuskegee, Booker T. Washington controlled black America. And he said to Callie House to cease and desist, but she refused. There is much to learn from our mother, our sister, this prophet. And I'm thankful that we are calling her name, and I'm thankful that we are seeking to learn from her example, that if we can indeed go back and fetch what these ancestors offer us, we can stand more strong in a day when I think muscular white supremacy and muscular nationalism seek to extinguish flames of justice and peace and righteousness. And so we have distinguished panelists here to talk about these ideas, about reparations. And I want to begin by asking Bishop McKenzie, if you would, Bishop, to share your thinking around reparations, around the present moment, where we are and where we might be able to go.
Thank you, Pastor Lamar, and to those of you who are with us virtually, good evening, and those of you who are in person in the sanctuary, we praise God for your presence. I too want to pause and thank those who are partnering with us in this discussion of reparations. I want to thank Harvard. We thank you, Monroe, William Monroe Trotter, and also the Law Department for being our partner tonight, as well as the other organizations whose name will be lifted later on. I want to thank our staff at NCC who has worked behind the scenes, and our consultant on civic engagement and outreach, the Reverend Stephen Green, and those who worked with him to make this night possible. let me share one or two things with you. The conversation about reparations is really being elevated globally, especially for indigenous people, and in the United States for the ancestors of those who were enslaved in America. Reparations is not a new conversation. It is a conversation that is now being elevated. Many people where we live in our neighborhoods don't feel that reparations is necessary because they don't feel it wasn't me. It wasn't I, wasn't my mother, wasn't my grandfather, it wasn't me. And why should we pay something or repair the breach caused by enslavement? Why should we be concerned about that in the first place when it hasn't happened before in America? That is not true. President Ronald Reagan, after the Second World War, apologized to Japanese Americans for holding them without their will. Not only did he apologize, but America paid each survivor $20,000 each for loss of property and for loss of time. African Americans, Africans in America, whose lives were stolen, whose future was stolen, and who also lost property and time, have not been compensated, even though there was law in place to do so. So Japanese Americans received reparations after a war, but Africans in America, 250 years of enslavement, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, and then countless other years for racist praxis and policies in housing and employment and more. Ta-Nehisi Coates says, until we repair this process, our compounded moral debt that America has incurred, America will not be whole. Let the church say amen. If that is not enough, then hear the word of the Lord. I'm reading from the NRSV updated edition. Deuteronomy, the 15th chapter, beginning at the 12th verse. Are you ready to hear what God's word says? If a member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or Hebrew woman, is sold to you and works for you 6 years, in the 7th year, you shall set that person free. And when you send a male slave out from you, a free person, you shall not send him out empty-handed. Let the church say amen. Provide liberally out of your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress, thus giving to him some of the bounty with which the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason, I lay this command upon you today. You may argue with history. It's difficult arguing with the Word of God.
Thank you, Bishop. Professor Brooks.
I'll just begin with a word of appreciation to my pastor, to Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, certainly to Bishop McKenzie, to all the conveners of this important conversation that occurs at a morally time-sensitive and historically urgent moment. As I was listening to Pastor Lamar and Bishop McKenzie, I'm reminded with respect to reparations that we can think of it in terms of a hidden face and hidden figures. In terms of a hidden face, we think about Callie House. As the pastors lifted up Callie House well before the NAACP reached 500,000 members on the eve of World War II, she created an organization between 300 and 600,000 at the turn of the century. Well before we came to understand the names or knew the names of Roy Wilkins and Rosa Parks, Callie House built this organization with chapters and members all across the country. She, as a hidden figure of history, brought the first federal lawsuit seeking reparations. She did not have the benefit of going to Harvard Law School or Howard Law School, but she brings the first federal lawsuit. In addition to that, she comes up, she wasn't a trained economist. The pastors reminded us that she was a washerwoman, a laundress, as the term went, but she nevertheless conceived of a reparations program based on pensions extended to Civil War veterans. But note this, the funding source, in terms of the federal litigation, she said, why can't we use the tax imposed on cotton harvested by enslaved people? This from a person who was not head of the Federal Reserve, not an economist, this hidden figure. And as the pastors reminded us, she was not rewarded for her intelligence. She was not rewarded for her incisiveness. She was, in fact, prosecuted by the federal government for what? Mail fraud. Why? Because she used the mail to encourage her members, the members of her organization, to support reparations. They charged her with fraud, and she served the better part of a year in federal prison. So this many years later, my colleagues at the Harvard Law School and Professor Ron Sullivan submitted, as of last week, a petition, a presidential posthumous petition on her behalf, asking Joe Biden to essentially pardon her for a crime she did not commit, this hidden figure. Okay? I would encourage you to look up the petition. Most legal papers or pleadings are often hard to get. This petition is available to the public. I would encourage you to go online, just look up Callie House, posthumous petition, William Monroe Trotter or Harvard, and look it up, and we ask that you reach out to the president. Lastly, with respect to hidden figures, that is to say, when you hear people talk about reparations, you hear three objections. Number one, that it is untimely. Slavery happened too long ago. Number two, that it is unworkable. There's no way in the world we can compensate, we can extend reparations to 300 million people. It is unworkable. And lastly, that it is too expensive. In other words, we can't afford it. My colleague, Linda Bilmes, who's an economist at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I are writing a paper that essentially shreds these three arguments. With respect to reparations being untimely, let us note this. L. Douglas Wilder, first black governor elected since Reconstruction, yet alive. His grandfather was an enslaved person. Let us note this. In 1938, the federal government sent agents all across the country to interview 2,000 some odd people who were formerly enslaved people. They represented a fraction of the 300,000 enslaved people who were alive at that time. Note this, in 2020, there were 90 some odd thousand Americans who were old enough to have known an enslaved person as an adult. There were 4 million people enslaved, 1 million people enslaved through the convict leasing system, which did not end until the first week of World War II. So it's not too long ago. Secondly, with respect to it being too expensive, my colleague and I have done an analysis of federal programs, and I will simply say this. That economic analysis shows that we engage in reparations every day. We just don't call it that. Whenever someone loses a house in some kind of natural disaster, we compensate them for it. We don't call it reparations. If a veteran loses a limb or is injured, we don't call it reparations, but is in fact reparations. This whole notion of extending or trying to make whole someone who's been harmed through no fault of their own is reparatory compensation. My colleague and I attempt to prove that in this economic analysis. Last point here, which is simply this. Is it unworkable? When we have literally thousands of programs every day which compensate Americans for a whole variety of harms. They're well run. They attempt to make people whole. They compensate not only victims, their descendants, indirect victims, every single day. We can afford it. It's doable. And the harm was not too long ago.
Professor Brooks, a follow-up question. How would this work if your paper proves convincing to policymakers and politicians? How do we make this work?
Okay. So let's think about it this way. Black people have suffered a wide variety of harms. So Black World War II veterans who did not receive educational benefits or housing benefits. They lost out on mortgages. They lost out on opportunities to become engineers, doctors, and school teachers. Those harms are measurable. They are quantifiable. They can be empirically documented. So one could conceive of extending scholarships to their descendants. One could conceive of writing checks. Professor William Darity has argued that we suffer literally a multi-trillion-dollar, essentially racial wealth gap. That could be addressed through the writing of checks. What I'm trying to suggest to you here is that when it comes to serving our people with compensating harms, we use a variety of means. So it can be writing checks, it can be providing scholarships, it can be a matter of extending to people credit. The point being here is, let us not underestimate our own fiscal and moral imagination. Let us not underestimate our own programmatic ability to respond to real harms. Last point here is, after World War II, GIs came home. We decided to make the greatest generation more whole in terms of providing educational benefits. In the name of our forebears, of Callie House, can we not demonstrate the same degree of moral and fiscal creativity? And so it's not a one-size-fits-all, one check fit all. It's a matter of using checks and scholarships and loans and credit and programmatic responses.
So Bishop McKenzie, I'm thinking about the fact that Mary Frances Berry's book about Callie House talks about the fact that she was a primitive Baptist, and that the idea of gathering formerly enslaved persons to petition to get pensions and reparations was hatched in the church. I think about the genesis of our own denomination, the Free African Society, and other mutual aid societies. The church has been, in our tradition, both the locus of liberation, but also the locus of bondage. Many conservative movements, the list goes on and on. I want to be good because we're being brought, but there's so many in our pulpits today, so many denominations, so many leaders who are extraordinarily conservative and would not risk their denominational clout or access on this issue. Can you say something about the internal tension of church as agent of liberation and church as chaplain of the present order?
Well, Pastor, I would say that, yes, that tension exists within the body of Christ. And sometimes people believe that it is an undoable, unworkable, it'll never happen in my lifetime, your children, and your children's children, so why should we spend time on a lost cause? The other part is, if we only see our ministry within the walls of the sanctuary, we may never address the issues that the people in the community and in the sanctuary face. So then our investment is only into the household of faith. It's only the priestly duties. I pray for you, I marry you, I bury you. The priestly functions, without taking a look at the other parts, other aspects of the ministry. Jesus, yes, had priestly function, all right, but he also went around doing good. He fed 5,000, and he demonstrated what that ministry was like. he didn't go to Pharaoh, or no, not Pharaoh, but he didn't go to the Roman government and say, if you would pass policy and provide funds, we can feed these 5,000. What he did is he told the disciples, what do you have? Meaning you already have it. It's within your means. You don't have to look anywhere else. And so with a fish sandwich, he fed 5,000. Wait now. And then there were leftovers that the people who gave went home with. So if I only see here, and I never see that I'm the pastor of the neighborhood, I'm the pastor of the community, that yes, I have a responsibility to pray. Yes, I have a responsibility to pray, but I also have a responsibility about what I'm praying about. If I have a responsibility to pray for the homeless, I also have the responsibility to be sure to pray and work against the policy that creates homelessness. If I'm called to pray for peace, yes, then I'm also called to work for policies, procedures, and protocols that make peace possible. If I am to pray and bury and console families, then I also must work to be sure that they don't have to be put in harm's way. So if I only see this, and I never see that I am responsible out there, then I won't work for that. So if I only see this, I'm comfortable. Are you comfortable? No, this is, you know, yeah, we're talking. I'm comfortable. You know, why rock the boat? It's not my issue. I can take care of my family without taking a look that harm has been caused. And you can be a reparations intercessor on behalf of the people who've been harmed. Does that help?
Y'all, was that helpful? I feel helped, right? Professor Brooks, help me with this. Scholars and thinkers have lifted up a nuance. I don't even know if you can call it a nuance, but that there is a thing beyond racism and racialized thinking called anti-Blackness. And you really cannot just have conversations around race and racism. You must also talk about anti-Blackness. Now, you talked about our Japanese brothers and sisters, and if I'm not mistaken historically, enslavers were paid reparations. They were made whole for their loss. Now, ooh boy. So, can you say something about the anti-Blackness that lies at the root then and now?
That's right. That's right. I'm more than happy to do so, and will do so. But I'd like to ask everyone here in this congregation of Congress, please take note of the term the bishop used in terms of a reparations intercessor. You know, there are moments of theological birth. Like, I think I just witnessed one, right? And that is a term that reminded me of the fact that when General Sherman issued Special Order 15 promising 40 acres in the mill, we don't remember the fact that he met with a group of preachers, which is where he got the idea of granting black people land. Like, so Bishop, that kind of reminds me of term, that, or it not reminds me, makes me think of this term of a reparations intercessor, right? Now, in terms of,
Well,
I have to get to the...
Before you get
No,
too
go
far,
ahead, go
before you get too far, I have to say I read that.
Okay.
It didn't just, you know, emerge. I read it in a book. The term reparations intercessor. And the author of the book is Willie Dwayne Francois III. And his book is Silencing White Noise. So I just want, because I don't want y'all to go, Bishop McKenzie said, and we had, she birthed a new term. Wait. I don't want the author to come to the one.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
No. But that is such a powerful notion. But in terms of anti-blackness, so Pastor Lamar has reminded us that one of the most notable and infamous instances of reparations in this country was the fact that we paid reparations here in Washington, D.C., to the tune of multi-millions in 2022 dollars to people who enslaved black people, right? Prior to the end of the Civil War, we extended reparations to white enslavers who had to set their enslaved people free, so the government gave them reparations. And as you well know, in terms of anti-blackness, we recall that Haiti, for many, many, many years, paid reparations for their own freedom. So we see this thread of anti-blackness with respect to our Japanese American brothers and sisters and siblings and children of God who were interned during World War II. Black folks led the fight for Japanese Americans to receive reparations, right? We led that fight. We were in that fight. And so we see over and over again the ways in which the plight of black people is exceptionalized. It's made aberrational. In other words, we say that your cries for justice are aberrational. They're exceptional. We have to do something extra for you, which suggests that we bear a particular burden, a particular hatred, a particular animus, a particular bias that is different, ontologically different, and worse than that borne by other people who bear the brunt of discrimination. That suggests to me a certain vigor that we have to bring to our fights. In other words, when having studied the fight for reparations for Japanese Americans, that was a fight that went over the course of a modest number of years, right? And as you know, Japanese Americans received reparations twice. Immediately after they were interned or shortly thereafter, and then subsequently at a much higher amount. We, on the other hand, had not received reparations once after many more years. So Pastor Lamar, with respect to anti-blackness, it is pronounced, it is profound, it is real, which means that we have to be all the more vigorous.
A question for both of you to consider, and Bishop McKenzie, if you would first, the tangible evidence that the labor of our enslaved ancestors created the wealth that pushed forward the American imperial economic engine. And one of the things that we don't consider is we think about the South, but it was the entire nation that benefited. We forget that there were markets where enslaved persons were sold in New York City. We forget that the textile industry depended upon the cotton harvested by our ancestors. So what of the tangible benefits to white families, to banks? We know the banking industry rests upon that wealth. We know the insurance industry rests upon that wealth. We know even in this city, Georgetown University, and so many other universities that are considered elite, Ivy, they rest upon that wealth. What is to be said, what is to be done when people say this was yesterday, when you looked at your account balance on yesterday, that wealth sits there? What say you, Bishop? What say you, Professor?
Well, the tangible evidence is that the nation has benefited from free labor. America has always counted on second-class citizenry, creating a class of people who will work, who will work hard for less, will take anything, less than minimum wage, even before minimum wage ever arrived. And so for Africans in America, it wasn't low paying, it was no paying. And so no paying, Benjamin Banneker designed Washington, D.C. No pay built the White House. No pay built the harbor in New York. in New York where Wall Street is, for no pay, harvesting and taking to market, receiving remunerations that they never received. And so on the backs of Africans in America, built a nation for free, for free. The tangible evidence today, tangible evidence today, tangible evidence today, consistently since enslavement, whenever a black community has been built and prospering, consistently, that wealth has been overtaken, often by force. Just touch your neighbor and say Black Wall Street. Prime property, like in Florida, family owned. Now all of a sudden we want to live by the waterside. So we just going to take your property and live on it and build condominiums with it. Tangible evidence coming into neighborhoods and communities who are disrupted, who are moved, neighborhoods destroyed, brand new housing is there, and the people who used to live there can't afford to come back and live there. And so now you're profiting off of what people have earned down through the line. Yeah, evidence everywhere.
Thank you, Bishop. Congresswoman, we welcome you, and would you all put your hands together? We welcome you. And we know that you have limited time, Congresswoman, it's a busy week. We just want to give you an opportunity to share your insight, to share about your legislation and where you think we are, and not only that, but how we may be of assistance to you. And would you turn the microphone on for her, please, Professor? Thank you.
To the senior pastor of this distinguished church, and I am honored and humbled to be here in your presence. I have been in this church, and some 27 years ago, we stood there as I was sworn into the United States Congress. We had the religious service at Metropolitan AME Church, and so this has an enormously special place in my heart, but as well, I'm always grateful amongst these bricks and mortar to see this place of worship, but also this place of fight and revolution. I'm delighted to see again Bishop Vasti McKenzie, and as we consider her a daughter of the South, a daughter of Dallas, a daughter of Texas, I told her I couldn't be more pleased that you all have the opportunity now to see her fight, her genius, and how she wraps the word into our life, our legend, and our future. And I'm delighted to see you. And thank you so very much. Brother Cornell Brooks, we have been together and in being together on this journey that I have been taking. So let me, Pastor is correct. I am in between and in betwixt. It is a moment in the post-pandemic, first time that we've had the Congressional Black Caucus. In 2 years, we've been separated, and so we have brought the brothers and sisters together, all requiring vaccines and boosters. So with that in mind, we have a feisty crowd, but we also have a contained. So we are streaming everything to make sure that the nation sees what we're doing, and I'm delighted that you're streaming. I'm standing up because I am very engaged in this concept and this reality of Callie House as introduced to us by Professor Brooks and his very able scholarship academician who is with him, in scholarship rather, and he's going to give me the name again, and I was with her, Dr. Linda Bilmes. This is sort of a vehicle that we can use for something that is a passion and something that I truly believe we have not put the energy, the soul, the DNA of black folk in. I don't know why we think less of ourselves. We do. Because if we thought more of ourselves, we would be diplomatically and nonviolently raging You notice what I've said. I'm in the church. I want no one running out and saying the member of the United States Congress who abhorred January 6, 2021, while she was laying flat on her stomach and the guns went off and the mob was banging. I would never charge you up, though we've had periods in our history as African Americans when folk thought that there were no other means. But I will not charge you up in that way. But I will charge you up by saying there should be such a massive outcry. Sister Callie House understood it in those years. Why am I with no recognition and compensation? But we have come along and we have been some of the greatest patriots of this nation. And I don't know why we can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Patriots, civil rights activists, talented 10th, intelligentsia, two-car garage, first-class rides on airplanes, and still understand the cruciality of this nation dealing with reparations. My cup is full. This bill was filed in 1989. Let me start. H.R. 40, the Commission to Study Slavery and Develop Reparation Proposals by my late friend, the Honorable John Conyers, who entrusted it to me. There's something about legacy. And I'm glad he handed it to me. I stood alongside him as long as from the beginning of my coming to Congress, was not in 1989. He introduced it 1 year after the Japanese Americans signed into law by President Reagan, as I understand, a Republican president, the American Civil Liberties Act. I supported, I believed in it. And when I say that after the fact, I was nowhere near Congress in 1989. And yet, Japanese American Association, by the way, one of the strongest supporters of the 350 organizations that include the Rabbinical Council, all of the major NAA, all of the major civil rights organizations, and all in between. But it has not gotten the hearts and minds of just plain folk. It is not being spoken from the pulpit. It's not being taught at the HBCUs to understand what this means. It is not a handout. It is not me holding my head down and shuffling and saying, I need something. That's right. It is the international concept of repair. The world understands when you're offended, the United Nations understand that it is reparations, it is repair. Why we, the descendants of enslaved Africans, cannot grapple with and our voices raise from the shining sea of the Pacific Ocean, from sea to shining sea, to the Atlantic, to the borders of Canada, and the borders of the South. Why has it taken so long? Why is it 2022 and I still go to audiences and people's eyes roll back in the back of their head? Or frankly, we have a discourse against each other about who is and who is not. Teach. I say something to diverse children when I go to the school. I said, we too are Americans. I let the little brown child, the little Asian child, the little poor child, the little shabby child, we too are America. When I talk to black folk, I say we're the greatest patriots that you've ever seen. Because the burden of slavery never stopped us from saying that my country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. We sing with tears in our eyes. And our faith is immovable. We are the amazing grace. We are the Donnie McClurkins. When I can't do anything else, I just stand. We've done that through thick and thin. When I can't do anything else, when I can't take it that Martin was killed, when Malcolm was killed, I can't take it anymore. I'm just stand. And so this idea has gotten 217 co-sponsors in the United States Congress. It's H.R. 40. People from every region, and they're not 217 folk that look like me. Their origins are different. And they've been able to understand, isn't that just fairness? Now, when people co-sponsor, they're looking for that wave at their backs. They're looking for folk when they go home saying, are you on H.R. 40? I want it to pass. There's not that championing of this legislation. 350 organizations. The documentation is real. And I'll just give a scanty, which I know these outstanding scholars have already spoken about. There is no doubt that the wealth gap is enormous. It varies. But I'll just take a number that we see bantered around, 177,000 for a white family of 4 to 17,000 for a family of 4 African Americans. It may not be none of you in this place, but there's a wealth of African Americans in numbers. And the statistics show that the wealth gap is enormous. We never got a birthright. We never got the inheritance that other families did. We never came as the Irish came, in complete poverty because of the famine, and became president of the United States of America. And John F. Kennedy being the first Irish Catholic, but also wealthy. Because not only was the stigma of slavery used against us over and over again that no other community can identify with, that there were stopgaps by the federal government, the state government, and local government to stop you from gaining wealth. 40 acres and a mule is not a joke. General Sherman's order said, let's do something with these folk because they can't be on the public dole. 400,000 acres should be dispersed at 40 acres and a mule. Just think if 5 slaves had come together and put 200 acres, they could have been the conglomerate that brought about Kellogg's. Or they could have been Purdue with their own name. Wealth was taken away. And the trajectory of that continued in the 19th century, the 1800s, when we thought we were in the midst of Reconstruction and we never finished. As I come to a close, I love it. Never finished. Because you were expendable. In the 1887, I want to say it's the 87 Compromise, I think it was 1887, when they said, well, they're not relevant, we can sacrifice them, we're getting rid of this Reconstruction because we want to make the South happy again. Let them get back in with their Jim Crow, the Klan came up, and you were underneath the foot. It was some dark days in the late part of the 19th century into the 20th century, and it continued. So you were never able to get that foot up. It was all by the laws of the land, and that's what the H.R. 40 is about. That's why it's a federal law. It is about the fact that it's a government. So all those who want to come to you and say, you weren't a slave, I don't want to have to pay for it. It was a government that consistently put in place a structure of your oppression or your economic oppression. Let me quickly go through the 20th century, which we continue to stay in more than the back of the bus, both economically, educationally, and otherwise. And so there were neighborhoods that we could not go in. Redlining was extreme, particularly in Chicago, but it was everywhere. Dr. King said he never saw racism like he saw in cities in the North. And so we were subjected to redlining. The GI Bill did not go to all black soldiers. It was state-based. And if you went to the South, they said, goodbye, Joe. You weren't getting the GI Bill. And so governmental resources were kept from you. When FDR decided to have Social Security, they made sure that it did not apply to the work we did, domestics and other type work. We didn't get Social Security. Government. And it goes all the way down into the military. Everybody champions them today, and I do it. But they were segregated. And we were segregated all through World War II. And we always know the stories that the German prisoners were treated better than our soldiers coming back home. There is so much that one would think that I'm recounting the pain and I just want a pat on the back. No, I'm trying to document, and there are eons of work that we will see from Professor Brooks' work coming forthrightly soon that can analyze the absolute rightness and righteousness of H.R. 40, as well as reparations. To not offend my brothers and sisters that don't look like me. I have no intent to offend. I would fight to the death for them. I was at the border when unaccompanied children started coming in under the Obama administration in 2014. I held little babies that were unaccompanied coming from the border. Desperate people do desperate things. And they had no qualms of sending children unaccompanied. We're not worried about labels and stigma, and isn't that a shame? We've got to not worry about what people will call us when we stand, because it is not for you, it's generations to come. Wouldn't you like to be able to live in a society that had already repaired or made every effort to repair what we lived through for over 200 years? Otherwise, we'll all still be singing the same song in 2050. We'll all be there, of course, 2065. We'll be singing the same song about slavery and who we are and what we are. If we cannot craft a pathway going forward, that is what this commission should be. And if we're given this opportunity, we should not waste it. It should be a commission of work and seriousness, embracing, of understanding, of writing, and moving the proposals out to be utilized. I close with this example. Today I spoke to a group of different cities that have taken this seriously and doing it on the local level. One of the most renowned ones, of course, is Councilmember Ruth Simmons out of Evanston, Illinois, where they took the marijuana dollars, the profits that came about the legalizing marijuana, and have put a fund together only for African Americans to be utilized for down payments for housing. If there ever is a community that is housing deprived, it's African Americans. And now in this era of high prices, even with the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think is superb, and the infrastructure bill, which is superb, work that President Biden has done is good work that's done with us. But we do know there are challenges. You never go into a place and don't mention that prices are going up. And housing is one of those areas. And so they're giving them the down payment, or they're rehabbing seniors' homes, strictly on the fact that they're getting a reparation. Not ashamed of it. The council voted on it. We've got to relieve ourselves of the shame, or that we have no time to worry about it, or that's something unrealistic, and begin to be the wind beneath those of us who are trying to ensure this commission is stood up, and that this story is not the same story over and over again, now in the 21st century and then into the 22nd century. With that in mind, I'm delighted to have been able to join this panel. Delighted for those who are listening and seeing us on streaming, and thank goodness for technology. I'm grateful for those of you who have come to join the concept of reparations. But it is the vast millions of African Americans who may come from different walks of life, hail maybe from the Caribbean, and now here. For as I said to someone, and my outrage over my governor and others dropping people someplace, because it brings me back to my history. I was dropped someplace, and it was through no fault of my own, and I didn't ask for it. And so I might have been dropped in Jamaica, or Trinidad, or Cuba, or Brazil. I was dropped, or I might have been dropped in that famous place in Virginia that everyone calls our first stop. Let's get over that and begin to talk about the collective concept, first starting in the United States being the bright light. For there were Africans who went to Europe only in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I can assure you that the Europeans are looking at the question of reparations. Why not us? Except for the lack of the body politic to be able to be enriched with their story and their history, and to be able to understand, if not me, then who? And as the scripture says, when the call came, the call did come. Which of you are going to say, send me? Because right now, I need millions of African Americans saying, send me, as we rise up to legitimately establish reparations as nothing to smile at or to laugh at or to discard, but a legitimate piece of our history that should not be rejected. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be with you. May God be with you. God bless you. God bless the United States of America, and God bless all of you.
Would you join me in thanking the Congresswoman? Thank you very much. If you have questions, please come to the microphone. Just a little more context as you come. I want to remind us of the Homestead Act of 1862, which also helps us to establish the fundamental anti-blackness of the American imperium. So in 1862, after taking land from natives, they gave land to white Europeans, millions of acres, and gave them money through the land grant institutions to learn how to cultivate it and to grow wealth from it. The government doesn't mind giving white folk wealth. It's been doing it for a very long time. It has not minded giving wealth to others, but it does mind doing right by us. And we need to make sure that we never forget it, and that those of us who have access, because Bishop McKenzie goes to the White House, Professor Brooks goes, and when we go before those with power, we're not taking pictures with them and grinning and skinning, but we are preaching to them the truth. And I will say this, Joe Biden would be eating ice cream in Wilmington, Delaware, were it not for black women in South Carolina who saved his behind during the primaries. And we ought not ever let him forget it. Yes, ma'am.
Testing.
Good. Grace and peace, everyone. My name is Leslie E. Redman. I'm originally from the inner city of Washington, D.C., born and raised, and I've been in Minnesota for a number of years. I was the president for the Minneapolis NAACP when Brother George Floyd was murdered. I've really appreciated this conversation today, especially as a millennial. I feel like a lot of wisdom is being lost as generations are transitioning, and our young people don't often have this conversation. And when I look around in the audience today, not only is it not enough millennials, but it's not enough young people that we could be activating. And I know that you all have done your work and are continuing to do it. So a lot of this burden is on myself and my fellow peers as well. But I just wanted to know, do you all have any ideas of how we can engage and how we can be of assistance to you all as you are continuing this fight and really get the masses joining in on this fight? Thank you.
Open to either of the panelists, please. Thank you for the question, sister.
So, first of all, let me just thank you for the question, because ultimately, these intergenerational racial harms can only be addressed intergenerationally. In other words, it's not enough for those who have spent years and decades wandering in the wilderness, but those who are the Joshua generation who will ultimately go into the promised land, who are going to do this work. Let me note this. So when I had the good fortune of leading the NAACP, I had the good fortune of working with Reverend Stephen Green and Reverend Devin Jerome Crawford. That work was joint and collective. I would note that in the same way that Martin Luther King answered the call of John Lewis and Claudette Colvin, the point being here is this work has to be intergenerational. In my work at Harvard, I work with students, 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds who are undergrad, but also graduate students, but also people who've never come to Harvard. So we have convenings at the Trotter Collaborative where we offer classes in advocacy on reparations to people who can simply sign on. That's the whole point. Now, with respect to your question of what can you do, a couple of things. The Congresswoman has lifted up the fact that we have H.R. 40 before Congress. She is responsible for it getting a hearing. She is responsible for whipping enough votes to get it out of the House. We are at a critical, decisive, and potentially morally dispositive moment. But in order for us to get H.R. 40 before the president, we have to create a grassroots movement. We have to make the case that reparations is not unworkable, right? It's not undoable, and that it is not too expensive. That means that we have to have these conversations about reparations. We need to talk about the debt that is owed to us, and we need to talk about housing. We need to get this information before the people. Lastly, I think it's incredibly important to not just talk about the figures, the math, the economics, but talk about the people, right? In other words, there's a reason why we have a posthumous presidential pardon petition for Callie House. Why? Because Callie House in 2022 is our Rosa Parks. She is our Claudette Colvin. We need somebody to remind the people of why we're in this fight for reparations. So we are asking people like hashtag, right, Joe Parton Cali, right? Make it simple. Help people to understand that it's about a person, but it's also about a history that we seek to exonerate. Last point here is what the bishop lifted up in terms of us understanding that this is doable. Remember, Callie House was not supported really by Booker T. Washington, not supported by W.E.B. Du Bois, not supported by the NAACP, but she had federal legislation supportive of reparations with no less a figure than Edmund segregationist Pettis as a supporter of the legislation. Now, if we can get racist segregationists behind reparations back then, what can we do now? Right? So it has everything to do with creating energy, creating a sense of momentum, and lastly, a sense of possibility. In other words, when people say it can't be done, you have to say it will be done. When they say it's too expensive, you say we do reparations every day. And lastly, when they say it's unworkable, you have to make people aware of the fact that we already engage in reparations, right? In other words, we cannot beg, we have to assert.
Thank you, Professor Brooks. My sister, if you'd introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Nikichi Taifa. I'm the director and founder of the Reparation Education Project. I've been working on the issue of reparations for over 50 years since I was a teenager. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, thank you so very much for your steadfastness, for carrying on the torch from John Conyers from 1989 to bring this issue of H.R. 40 finally and completely to reality, because I know it's going to happen because I do have faith. I want to say that in the context of my work for reparations, I've always lifted up the voice of Callie House. Callie House and Reverend Isaiah Dickinson, the National Ex-Slave Mutual Bounty and Pension Association, which, as you said, at its height had over, I would go along with what you said, 600,000, though they say 300,000, but they always underestimate that. My question is, I've also been in the forefront of calling for the exoneration, posthumous pardon for the Honorable Marcus Garvey, working with the law firm of A. King Gump and with Professor Justin Hansford and others. I testified on that issue before, actually, Congressman, the judiciary hearing on the Office of the Clemency and the Pardon Attorney, and I lifted up Marcus Garvey. So when I heard that about this effort for a posthumous pardon for Callie House, I said, right on. I want to know if we've been working closely with the Office of the Pardon Attorney, and we're working on specific criteria for posthumous pardons because they have not wanted to go down that route, okay? I'm just saying, they have not wanted to go down that route. So my question is, are you receptive with respect to this effort in terms of joining or at least talking to those of us who have been working on the Honorable Marcus Garvey posthumous pardon actually for decades? But there might be some synergy here because both of them did not commit a crime. They both came from essentially the same time period. They both were eschewed by the black middle class and black intelligentsia, okay? They both were convicted of mail fraud. There's one is a man, one is a woman. There's synergy there. So I want to know if you're receptive to sitting down with talking to some of us because we have very, very similar interests here, and there might be a road towards victory for both. So.
I'm going to let all of the wonderful panelists know how great Nkechi Taifi is, as I know her to be. I see the synergism. And you don't mind me acknowledging Reverend Mark Thompson, who is here, who's Mr. Reparations, who sings and has got beautiful music. Let me just say this. I'm going to let Cornell answer that. I see a window. I see a light. I see that as helping the young woman, I think who wanted to see what her role could be. Social media is so powerful, and you can do what Professor Brooks said, and then you can also take up H.R. 40 to try to ask the question, are you not pushing for H.R. 40? Just develop your own social media around that, and also go wherever you go to organizations and mention, do you even know, you don't have to be a scholar, you can just basically look on our different websites to know the concept of reparations repair. Just want to tell her that. But I do invite all of you all to register for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. You can do so, and then you can join us tomorrow at 4:30 in the Convention Center for our reparations session, which you are on, are you not?
Yes.
So make sure you invite them to that, free, and you will be filled with the array of geniuses that you will hear. I'm going to yield to Cornell for that synergism. I certainly support the pardon of our dear brother Marcus Garvey. Paul Robeson was in that group much later, of course, but there were all kinds of our angels and, how should I call them, angels of the revolution that suffered the harshness of this system and the harshness of the law that we should correct. And that is what repair is. It's all under one umbrella. That is the repairing of our souls, repairing of our history, repairing of our economic condition. That's what it is. And that's what H.R. 40 is, a big umbrella to be able to analyze and do all that. But I do want to yield to you for the actual answer that deals with that. Thank you all. Forgive me for departing. This has been stupendous, and I thank you for honoring me to allow me to even be here. Thank you so very much.
So first of all, as the Congressman leaves, I just want to express my appreciation to your work over the years. Over the years. This is a very difficult issue. You brought us to a very powerful place, and just much gratitude, and I look forward to seeing both of you all tomorrow. So, thank you, sir. Short answer in terms of your question, pardon petitions have to go to two places. One, to the Pardon Office in the U.S. Department of Justice, and to the White House Counsel's Office. The standards for pardons are amorphous. They're undefined. The president has essentially an unfettered or near unfettered right to grant pardons for federal crimes. And so if the president has broad authority, we too should assume a broad authority in terms of the kinds of pardons we support. I am more than happy to reach out to my colleague, Professor Ron Sullivan, to see if we can have a conversation about how we can better work together, because I'll simply note this. As Pastor Lamar has lifted up, this stigma prevents us from advocating on our own behalf. In other words, if our forebears are stigmatized and otherized, then we have our voices muted. If we can, in fact, pardon a person, vindicate a history, exonerate a history, we then are empowered to speak on our own behalf. So these pardons are really, really important. It's not just about the past, it's about the present.
Let me say that I'm excited to hear you and excited to know that you've been working since 16 to do this. The conversation, the other young lady talked about how do we get more millennials participating. You have to have the conversation where they are, and they are virtually. They're not as necessarily in person. So thank you for sharing, because the conversation needs to be in the church, and it needs to be in the convention center, and it needs to be wherever people are gathered. That's how you build momentum, to be able to create the push to get it forward. We can all be reparation intercessors. You can write your congressperson and your senator. You can write a letter to the editor. You can write an op-ed. You can arm yourself with all the data and facts so that when someone says something to you, you can say, yes, the United States has paid reparations before, and the United States can do it again. And there are a variety of ways. It's not just a paycheck. We haven't talked about post-traumatic stress syndrome, that if we really look carefully, there's a whole race of people who are suffering post-traumatic stress syndrome from racial hate-fueled oppression. What would reparatory intercession look like if we were able to provide services for people who have been traumatized by racism?
Dr. Perry?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ravi Perry. I'm a political scientist at Howard University. I have a question about what do we do regarding when we get in our own way. So we know that there are persons of African descent who some say ought not to receive reparations should we get to the point of distribution. I'm curious what you each say in terms of, let's say reparations is approved tomorrow, who gets it? That's the question. Who gets it?
I think that's what H.R. 40 is about, if I'm not mistaken, to create the commission to be able to study and to see how best to approach it. But there is documentation through the census to be able to identify descendants of those who are enslaved. You know, my great-great-grandfather was enslaved. I know his name, I know his wife, I know where they were born, I know where they lived, and I know that he worked to free himself and then free all of the members of his family. So, I mean, there's history, some people know their history, but there are other census and other records to be able to trace and track.
This is a very difficult, as the Bishop has lifted up, a very difficult issue, right? Because you have people who essentially say that black people who are the descendants of slaves, who are the original victims of America's original sin, they are not only first in queue, but perhaps should be the only people in the queue. I would ask that all of us collectively consider this. It is true that people who are the descendants of slaves bear a particular long-standing burden and harm, and we can prove that. But I ask the question, are there other black people who have also been harmed? So as president and CEO of the NAACP, I had the good fortune of bestowing on Sidney Poitier the NAACP's highest award. Sidney Poitier was born on Cat Island. He was not born in South Carolina or North Carolina. His descendants, his forebears were not American slaves, but he lived through Jim Crow segregation. He contributed mightily to black people's liberation. I think about Harry Belafonte. And so my point being is, can we not apply our moral creativity, our intellectual creativity to recognize a wide variety of harms and a wide variety of victims so that reparatory compensation addresses the whole of the harm, right? So it's not about identity politics, but it may be about identifying everybody who's been harmed, thinking about thoughtful, careful, strategic ways to address those harms, and not have that conversation before we have the bill, right? So it's like asking the question, whose name is on the check, before we figured out whether or not the checks are going to be issued. I just posed the question.
Thank you very much. And our final question, my sister here.
Thank you.
Go right ahead, it's on.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, this space. My name is Kenneth Henry. I am the national co-chair for the national well-known grassroots organization in COBRA, National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. I don't have a question so much as an observation. Reparations, in my estimation, must be harm-based. We talk about the transgenerational epigenetics of the enslavement of our ancestors and how it passes down from generation to generation. My observation is I have an amazing relationship with our Japanese American family, and I appreciate when we talk about that they got reparations. I would like to put this on the table. In 1891, 11 Italian Americans were lynched in New Orleans. The Italian American community in this country went ballistic. Italy went ballistic. How could you do this to our brethren? At the same time that 11 Italian Americans were lynched, 192 Negroes were lynched. The president at that time was Benjamin Harrison. He felt that he had to do something to make this right. In 1892, while 225 Negroes were being lynched, President Benjamin Harrison, with the flick of a wrist and some ink in his quill, decreed that the families of those 11 Italian Americans who were lynched in New Orleans would get reparations. He gave each family $25,000. If they had been in a position where they could just put it in a can somewhere in the backyard or invest it or whatever, allegedly today it would be worth $720,000. The good president felt that that was not enough. So he felt that in addition to that $25,000 per each of 11 Italian American families, that he had to do more. And I challenge all of you in here to tell me what the one thing was that he did in addition to giving those, that group, the Italian Americans, that reparations. What was the other thing that he did? He gave the Italians an amazing, you may say, national holiday. That's where Christopher Columbus holiday came from, courtesy of President Benjamin Harrison. So when we talk about who all got reparations and who deserves it, and I too have been on the front line, not as long as my sister back there with 50 plus years, but I have been on the front line. He did not say to Congress, we need you to legislate a bill to get us to a point where we can have a commission just to look at 400 plus pernicious years of our history and the vestiges therefor. So it's just an observation, but I thank you for the opportunity to be here to share it with you.
Thank you so very much for your presence, each and every one of you, for what you have brought here to enrich our experience. Would you help me by thanking our distinguished panelists, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee in her absence, Reverend Professor Cornell William Brooks, Bishop Vashti Murphy McKenzie. We're thankful, and as pastor of this wonderful congregation, again, it's just an honor to continue our legacy of liberation and worship and service together. I want to give the last word to our ancestor whom we honor today, Callie House. Hear these words. If the government had the right to free us, she had a right to make some provision for us. And since she did not make it soon after emancipation, she ought to make it now. Hashtag she ought to make it now. Go in peace and make it happen. Thank you all very much. Beloved, those of you who are here, we want to invite you to the prayer service, which will begin shortly. Would anyone, I think Reverend Devin or Reverend Green, will begin probably in about 20 to 30 minutes. Am I right? But Reverend Devin, would you like to say a word about the prayer service? We'd like for you all to stay if you're able.
Thank you, Pastor Lamar. We invite you to stay. The prayer service will begin at 6 p.m. So in 15 minutes, we'll convene in this same space to pray one with another for this evening. It'll only be 1 hour, so we invite you to come and stay and invite others to join us as well.